Well, good evening, everybody. Hello, and welcome to this joint event with King's College, the Centre for Geopolitics, and the Centre for Governance and Human Rights. I'm Michael Proctor. I'm the Provost, the head of King's College. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce this event. Thank you, audience, for joining us this evening. I understand there are 356, exactly, registered members and friends from around the world, so thank you very much for joining in with us. We'll be discussing this evening a tremendously important topic. It affects all of us, wherever we are in the world. How do we recover from a pandemic like this? And what will our world look like in the near and longer term future? We're delighted to have a distinguished panel of experts with us. Our chair this evening is Professor Jason Sharma. Jason is the Sir Patrick Shee Professor of International Relations in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge, and he's a Fellow of King's. Jason, thank you very much for taking on the chairmanship. And I do want, before I go, I just want to say a special thank you to all the King's alumni who've joined this event and for their continued support of the college over the past difficult months. And now I'm going to hand over to Jason, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you very much, Provost. As the Provost has mentioned, my name is Jason Sharma. As chair, I have two duties this evening. The first is to give a brief introduction of our four panelists. The second is a couple of matters of online housekeeping and logistics. In order of speaking, our first speaker is Dr. Charlotte Holdcroft, a King's alumna and college research associate working in the Department of Medicine. During the pandemic, she's been involved in sequencing the shift in genetics of COVID-19 as fast as possible, providing real-time data that can help map the spread of the disease and its mutations. Rui Patel is a PhD student in King's in chemical engineering and biotechnology, working to build a robust and affordable ventilator machine that can be manufactured and maintained in low and middle income countries. Sharif Srinivasan is a Fellow of King's College, is co-director of the Centre for Governance and Human Rights, is also David and Elaine Potter Lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Studies. Recently, he's been working with Africa's Voices Foundation on a risk communication and community engagement response to COVID-19 in Kenya and Somalia. Finally, Kamiyama Mahades is a senior lecturer in economics and policy at the Cambridge Judge Business School and also a Fellow of King's. His areas of research are on macroeconomics, particularly applied macroeconomics, global and national microeconomic modeling, energy economics, and climate change. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for agreeing to speak tonight. This is obviously an online webinar. I will moderate the discussion with the panelists for about 40 minutes, at which point we will hand over to answer questions from the audience. You, of course, can see and hear us, but everyone in the audience has the camera and microphone turned off, so no one else in the webinar will be able to hear what you say. However, of course, audience members can communicate with us via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage you to type in questions for the panelists. I would ask that people start off by telling us your name and affiliation. Secondly, to say which panelists your question is directed to. And finally, that in light of the numbers this evening and the available time, that you do just limit yourself to one question. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can in the available time. Finally, and importantly, I would say that this event is being recorded tonight as well, and in a couple of days, it will be possible to see it at the Centre for Geopolitics website, www.cef.polis.cam.a.uk. With this, I'm going to hand over to our panelists to make some brief introductory remarks, starting with Dr. Charlotte Holdcroft. Charlotte, thanks very much.
Good evening. I'm hoping that you can all hear me okay. I think I should start with answering a question that was submitted in advance, which was someone asking, what does COVID-19 actually mean? What does it stand for? And it's a shortening, a portmanteau of coronavirus disease. You've got the the VI from virus, and then the D from disease, and 2019, because COVID-19 is caused by a coronavirus that was first isolated in Wuhan in China in December 2019, though it has now spread around the world. And while many of us will have experienced coronavirus infections before, because 25 to 50% of common colds are caused by these viruses, COVID-19, caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2, causes severe respiratory distress, is new to humans and really isn't found in Europe, despite what some press might tell you, until February 2020. So this is really a very new disease that we're learning about very fast. I've been working at Addenbrooke's to sequence samples of the virus from people all over east of England. So this is from Peterborough down to Watford, across to Chelmsford, and then Bedford in the other direction. So it's a real snapshot of what's going on in the east. And we find that this virus picks up two mutations in its genetic code every month, about one a fortnight. And we can use that to some extent track how this virus moves around the country and around the world. And so one of the first things that I think is particularly relevant to say tonight is that the very initial test and trace that we did in the UK, the sort of infamous cases of the two Chinese tourists in York, the businessman who arrived back in Brighton and kicked off a cluster, those viruses were very successfully shut down by the Public Health England test and trace work. The UK is actually very good at contact tracing in infectious disease outbreaks, though they don't normally take place on this scale. And we know that they worked because the viruses that seeded the epidemic that really began in March are unrelated to those two outbreaks that took place in Brighton and in York. We stopped those transmission chains. So all that isolation was working, and that should give us faith to test and trace in the UK going forward, that it does work. And these policies of going out and finding everyone who's had close contact for more than 15 minutes, you can successfully stop each of these outbreaks. The problem is that instead of there being a single patient zero, which I think is the initial situation that was envisaged by SAGE, there were 1,300 patient zeros at least for COVID-19 in the UK. There was at least 1,300 infected people who spilled into the UK from elsewhere in Europe, and not especially from Italy, actually largely from France and Spain over that February half-term period, and that's really when things got out of hand. So we should have some faith that test and trace work. And I think when we look at the global situation, we actually have things to learn from other countries. If you look at countries like South Africa, you look at places that have had Ebola outbreaks, they have very strong contact tracing teams. They have an awful lot of expertise of working without genomics, sometimes working without diagnostics, just going and hunting down each symptomatic person and their contacts and breaking the chains of transmission. And they have honed those skills on Ebola, on tuberculosis, on HIV, and a range of other infectious diseases. The problem is going to come with the fact that we are going to have to pull all of those expert human contact tracers off these other high consequence infectious diseases. We're going to have to ask those people to stop looking for TB cases. We're going to have to ask them to stop looking for HIV cases. We're potentially going to have to tell them to stop looking for Ebola cases or look for Ebola cases and COVID cases at the same time. And that's where we're likely to see long-term repercussions in many other parts of the world, where they have the expertise and the manpower, but they're also having to deal with extremely serious ongoing outbreaks of other diseases that will resurge as we try and crush COVID. And I think that's something that I'm hoping that the other panelists can perhaps shed some light on, because that's less of an area of expertise to me, what these consequences of these other infectious diseases might be in the future, particularly for the global sector. And thanks very much for listening to my introduction.
Thank you. Ruhi, perhaps if I could hand over to you.
Thanks, Jason. So to give a bit of a background on what I've been doing regarding the Ventilator project in Cambridge, I've got a couple of pictures to look at. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. To give an idea of the kind of things we've been making. So So this is an image of the latest ventilator prototype that we've been working on, and it's been taken at the Whittle Lab, which is where a large portion of the design and manufacturing of the initial prototype has been taking place. And so to give a bit of background on who's been working on this work's been carried out as part of the Open Ventilator System Initiative, and this was established in order to design an affordable ventilator design that is available to people worldwide, and to allow an openness of sharing this ventilator design for countries to be able to manufacture ventilators using their manufacturing companies. And so you can see a range of people have been involved in the process, and this involved engineers, clinicians, and large manufacturing companies who are now working to make this ventilator through a mass scale production process. And so to show you how the device has changed from the initial prototype, which was built, I believe, in early March, when there was a call for ventilators from the government. You can see how the initial prototype has been developed into a prototype which is far more simplistic, and a lot of the complexity has been tackled through simplifying the manufacturing processes as well as removing components in order to make this a more affordable device. So one way we have approached this is to use a manufacturing process called injection molding. So that's what I've been involved in for this project, is a lot of the manufacturing and material selection. So we've been using a material called PON, and you can see on the right here is a device which has been injection molded using this polymer. And the way it works is that the machine injects molten polymer into a metal mold, and that polymer takes the form of the mold. And so one of the components that we've been involved in manufacturing is the V-flow meter, and this is used to measure the flow rate of gas through the device. And so to give you an idea of what manufacturing about, I think, 88 of these devices took, we manufactured a mold initially with the help of James Taylor, who's been teaching me how to do CNC machining as part of my PhD project on hot valves. And so you can see at the top is this CNC manufactured mold, and this is an automated process which involves making metal parts through a CAD design. And so Marta in our research group helped to design the CAD for this mold, and these were injection molded with the help of Joanna, who's also in my research group, and James too. So that's kind of one approach that we've been using to mass manufacture parts for the prototype. Another one is the linear flow meter. So the V-flow meter was tested by the team at the Whittle Lab, and we realized that there needs to be a greater degree of precision, and so the team decided to use a new design. And once again, CNC molds were manufactured with aluminium, and these were used to injection mold polymer components. Finally, another component is the solenoid valves, and so these are the inhalation and exhalation solenoid valves, and their job is to push air through the device. They contain a plunger which moves up and down to move oxygen and air through the device. And so these were actually a hybrid design which involved using both processes. So some of them were injection molded components, as you can see on the left, and some of them were CNC manufactured components in the center there. And these parts were all assembled and made into 40 solenoid valves, which were sent to South Africa to a company called DeFi, and DeFi have been working closely with us on manufacturing a ventilator, and here is an image of the latest drawing of what it will look like. And so we've been spending pretty much all our time communicating with them and making these components for the ventilator in order for them to have a device which can be hopefully regulated in South Africa and distributed to people there once it's passed the criteria for safe medical use. And so I hope that's given a bit of background of what I've been involved in for the ventilator project. And thanks for listening.
Thank you. Sharma, maybe I could hand over to you.
Thanks, Jason. So I would like to take us out of the sciences to the social sciences and also to Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Africa, where I do a lot of my work. And I want to start with a voice, a message, an SMS message to be precise, from a Somali man, 39 years of old, reports as being recently displaced and living in Mogadishu, in the capital. He was asked for his views on coronavirus, and he wrote a couple of months ago, "Coronavirus has committed a huge crime against economically developed countries. It has killed leaders, rich people, and famous individuals. But it has ever been killing poor people, and no one talked about it, or the world quarantined because they are poor." So this is a perspective of someone about what coronavirus means to them. And it's interesting to think of what coronavirus signifies for someone who's living in these kinds of precarious circumstances. He was thanked for his message and encouraged to follow health advice in a response by SMS. And then he sent another message, a question, and it said, "Between coronavirus and hunger, which is worse?" So this is the kind of perspective that I think reminds us that if you're in a very different circumstance, for example, an internally displaced person on the outskirts of Mogadishu, facing insecurity, precariousness, cholera outbreaks, cyclical drought, a locust plague this year, which has damaged livelihoods, you don't necessarily see a global once-in-a-lifetime health crisis. You see new risk and new trouble that's mixing in with old risk and old trouble. And this affects how you interpret what you hear, who you trust, and how you act. And above all, it affects your experience of this virus in distinctly different ways than it would affect you or me. So my interest for some time has been in understanding these kinds of worldviews. What does COVID-19 mean from a community perspective? And how does that affect the way that we communicate with communities in order to tackle this virus through their collective action as well? And that's really one of the lessons of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, in which the experience of the outbreak from the community perspective led to anger and hostility towards the response and the authorities. And also importantly, to the concealment of cases, to hidden burials, and lots of practices that circumvented the formal health advice and contributed to the spread of the epidemic. So my work with the Center of Governance and Human Rights and with Africa's Voices Foundation, which stemmed from this research and is based in Kenya, is about the pillar that's called risk communication and community engagement, which is increasingly seen as important to the way that we respond to health emergencies. And the very first point that really comes from that is that in contexts where there's challenge with an effective health and biomedical response, obviously the preventive and containment solutions based on health communications and collective action at the community level are very important. But paradoxically, in some of these contexts, these are often the harder contexts because the trust in authorities and in expertise is also weaker. So the communication challenge is actually even more heightened. And so the work that I've been doing and supporting with Africa's Voices is finding out how do you build these trusted communication channels to understand the changes in community perspectives and feed that to authorities in terms of how they tailor their response, but then also to use trusted communication channels to communicate more effectively. And when we sought the views of Somalis in the early days of coronavirus in early April, we heard from over 7,500. It was a self-selected sample, but it was a qualitative analysis of their perspectives, like the one you heard. One of the really strong things that came out was that the dominant frame of thinking about the virus was a religious one, to trust in God and to have faith, and that if you did that, then you'd be safe. And at the sharp end of that was a concern, kind of a stigma and hostility, that the virus doesn't exist, or that it only affects non-believers, and that actually what we should do is get rid of non-believers, etc., from the country. So you have this sense of a continuum of the dominant frame and also the sharp end of its concern. And what really struck us there was that one of the key elements here is control, and how people seek to exert control over something like this new information of a virus, and who they then obviously trust in terms of allowing for others to influence their control. And that was very important, because in the early stages of the virus, the kind of dominant international response was still very much the classic public health response and getting the key messages out. And the religious authorities and leaders in the country needed to be much more closely brought in. So it was, with others, the kind of ways of influencing a shift in the response around this voice being more heard was central to our concern. I think there are two other points I'm just going to spend a very short time mentioning. And the first one is that the virus spread and the secondary socioeconomic effects and the challenges of a vaccination drive in contexts like Eastern Africa, these are all in the really early stages. And I think we're not talking about beyond coronavirus in that sense. We're not talking about recovery. On a day in which there's exciting news about agreements for EU countries, or the promising results from the vaccination trials in Oxford, this doesn't really look like a 2020 impact and 2021 recovery story in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but rather the transmission growing steadily, and that 2021 is when we'll see even some of the more graver impacts. And so I think the timeframes and time horizons through which this is being experienced in other parts of the world are going to look quite different to the ones that we hopefully will experience here if all goes to plan. And my final point here is that I think one of the dilemmas that faces leaderships in countries like Kenya, like Somalia, is a challenge of, if they're locking down harder and earlier and stronger, the kind of socioeconomic impacts are quite severe and will lead, no doubt, to unrest and anxiety. And yet at the same time, they have to be seen to be acting strongly, because as other countries in the global north do emerge from this, they will become a source of primary risk of the recurrence of infection, etc. So there's real challenges to navigate this politically as this unfolds over the next 12 to 18 months. I'll leave it with my comments there.
Thank you, Sheriff. Kemia, finally to you.
And I'm going to try to share. I hope you can see this slide. So perfect. So thank you very much. I thought of just discussing a few impacts, the macro impacts, and as you know, the world have obviously experienced a large number of macro shocks over the last 4 decades. We've had the OPEC crisis in 1973, 74. We've had the Iran war, the Iranian Revolution, and most recently, we obviously experienced the Great Recession over the last 10 years. But this type of shock that we've observed, the cocktail of shocks that we're observing, is really unprecedented. And I want to spend just a few minutes just explaining why I think it's sort of very important to understand the difference, because it will have an impact on how the recovery happens. As you know, in the absence of vaccine, hopefully we'll have a vaccine soon, or effective treatment. What happened was many countries and most of the world actually went into lockdown. This is what some people call the Great Lockdown or the Great Shutdown. And the aim really was to flatten the epi curve, and most countries, a lot of countries, have been successful in doing that. We see rise in cases in Iran and Brazil and other parts of the world still, unfortunately. But that was the sort of the medical containment policies. But the containment policies that we also had to live with, it meant that the recession curve, if you want, basically deepen. So we're going to a much worse economic situation than we would have had if we didn't have the containment measures. The problem then is this time has been really unprecedented in the sense that the economic rescue packages that we have seen have been very strong and very quick, much larger than under the global financial crisis, and much faster response than under the global financial crisis. So if you look around the world, you see monetary policy has been accommodative across the board. If you look at fiscal policy, it's been really sizable. Discretionary fiscal policy has been very sizable, etc. So one thing new about this is that basically fiscal and monetary policy, huge and strong response from advanced economies, and in emerging and developing countries where there is space, there has obviously been a strong response. And you can see that this is basically the recession curve for small businesses in the US. Very containment measures come into place, there's a huge drop in activity, in number of hours work in this case. So that this is very unlike the great financial, the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. And then it's not surprising perhaps that we are probably experiencing the one of the four. It's bound to be the fourth worst global recession since 1871, with a significant proportion, if you look at the left chart, significant proportion of economies in the world in recession this year. So and the reason for that is the COVID-19 pandemic and also the policies to mitigate the spread have had economic consequences, including supply, demand, and confidence. So on the supply side, obviously, we have these supply disruptions that some of us observed. We had local, regional supply disruption, global supply disruption. On the demand side, obviously, there's a loss of income and livelihoods. And then we have had the heightened uncertainty. And what's also very worrying is that it's also the first time since the Great Depression that we have both advanced and emerging economies in recession. And this is problematic because if you remember the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, the engine of growth in the global economy was really the emerging markets and China in particular. But the latest projections are extremely, extremely worrying. So that's another very different than what the other shocks that we observe. And thirdly, the hit to services have been much more significant than to manufacturing. So in a typical a macro shock, you observe that manufacturing get hit worse, but here actually what we observed is that services have been hit, and this might be a good thing because it basically means once we come out into phase 2, so containment measures are lifted gradually, maybe economic activity will rebound very quickly because people will go out to restaurants and into shops and buy things. Unfortunately, the evidence that we've seen, for instance, from China is that services are lagging behind manufacturing, and that's, I think, will be what we will observe here in the UK too. So even though the shops are open, people choose to socially distance, in other words, not even go into the shops. Some data from Sweden, I always get asked questions about Sweden. Economic activity in Sweden was also hit very hard, even though there wasn't a real sense that the government shut everything down. People chose not to go out to shops and go out to restaurants, even though they could. And I think this is a lesson probably we are observing in the data in the UK, for instance. I'm going to skip to the last point I want to make, and this is actually, I'm very worried about this. You know, what this is telling us, there's a huge divergence between financial markets and the real economy. If you look, S&P 500, the equity market, the index in the United States, is back to where it was just before the crisis. And this tells you that perhaps the markets believe that this will be a V-shaped recovery. We will have a strong recovery. And this happens even in case, if you look at, for instance, Brazil, markets are, been not as fast as the S&P 500, but been recovering. And this disconnect is very worrying because it could, I mean, to me, it raises concerns of excessive risk-taking and significant vulnerability. So I think I'll stop there and open up, return back to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Kemial. Thanks very much to each of our 4 panelists. I do want to follow up briefly with questions for each of the panelists now, but to audience members, please do send in your questions. And once again, that's via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen with your name, the panelist's name. And as I say, please do try to keep to 1 question. Charlotte, maybe if I could start off with you. You mentioned the kind of track and trace system at the beginning, and how successful it has been in some ways in the UK, but surely coronavirus is a moving target. How do we track the virus as it mutates? How can we return to normality as that happens?
There's been quite a lot of interest and press coverage on the fact that the virus is mutating, which you're absolutely right, it's a moving target. It mutates all the time, that's what it does. There's been a lot of debate about what do different mutations do, what do they mean. So far, we have no evidence that there are different strains of the virus. They've characterized, researchers in the US have characterized a range of about 20 different mutations that have occurred all over the world in just one part of the virus, which is the spike. It's on the surface, and it's the part of the virus that it uses to get inside your cells, and it's also the part of the virus that your immune system produces the most effective immune response against. And when they've taken antibodies from people who've recovered from severe cases of COVID, where they were really very unwell, and they have very high antibody titers, they can test those antibodies against each of these 20 different spike mutations. And what they find is that one antibody from an individual infected with any strain, or sorry, any variant of COVID identified so far, will neutralize, will stop in its tracks all of the other mutations. So what we know at the moment is that none of the diversity that currently exists around the world seems to have any effect on escaping from the antibodies that people are producing so far. And this is because this is a new virus, and as much as it's a moving target, humans are a virgin population. We have never experienced this virus before. There's no significant pre-existing immunity. The virus is currently under no pressure to mutate in a significant way that will get around the immunity of people who've been infected already, because there's so many people left still to be infected. If we look at somewhere like New York or like London, only between 15 and 20% of people in some of the most affected cities in the world so far have been infected. That still leaves another 80 to 85% of the population who are to some extent vulnerable to the virus. So we won't really see the virus mutating in a significant way that would perhaps potentially require a vaccine design until we start to get to a figure of 60 to 70% of the population infected. And what we hope is that with current vaccine designs that are being trialed at the moment, it would be relatively quick once we had a vaccine that worked to some extent to modify it if we had to deal with a new target. But the first thing to do is to try and get a vaccine that works, full stop. And whether that's going to be before Christmas, like Boris Johnson promised, I think that's quite an ambitious promise. I don't think Boris Johnson should have promised before. But no, the virus is quite happily ripping through populations without having to develop any new or virulent mutations at the moment, and probably won't experience that immunological pressure for another year or two.
Thank you. Rui, maybe if I could hand over to you. Sharath pointed out that the beyond coronavirus title may be very inapplicable in global terms. We see the slope of infections rising. What are the chances that we'll be able to get ventilators that will be affordable enough to cope with the continuing growth in infections outside of the West, and the possibility of a second wave as well? Rui, I think you're muted.
There we go. Sorry. Thanks, Jason. So in terms of manufacturing affordable ventilators, something that I've learned from this project is that manufacturing ventilators may not need to cost as much as it comes across in terms of medically used ventilators. They cost about £10,000, and the ventilator that we've developed is priced at around $1,000, and so that's around 1/10 of the price. And so the way that we've gone about coming up with this design is looking outside of medical device manufacture and into other industries where manufacturing is a big part of making products, such as, for example, the companies we're working with are home appliance manufacturers, DeFi and Tinel. And once a team member of mine, who's the engineering lead of the project, said jokingly, we could probably manufacture a ventilator from the parts in a dishwasher. And it wasn't so far from the truth. I mean, a lot of components can be taken from outside and adapted to medical applications by changing the materials and few aspects of the design. But this addresses the affordability, but the challenge is actually manufacturing these through companies. And though it may have taken a proportionately short amount of time to do this as a team, working together, having our own small roles in developing the device, transferring this to a large-scale company where you've got a whole team doing just manufacturing polymer components and a whole team manufacturing the metal components. This is a lot more tricky to scale up. And so in order to manufacture components quickly enough, we need to have companies which are able to have a continuous workflow so that these ventilators can be manufactured efficiently. Another aspect to consider is also the certification process. So in order to certify a ventilator, many different countries have different processes. And I imagine that something like having a standardized system of certifying ventilators would be very helpful with something like this, where ventilators are needed worldwide, regardless of which country it is talking about. So those are two aspects which are kind of maybe the key to answering how we can fulfill this need.
Thank you. Shareth, you mentioned in the example that this crisis looks very different from, say, the outskirts of Mogadishu than it might do from the UK, and it's been talked about in terms of inequality. Could you give us some idea of, the differential impact in Africa or perhaps the developing world more generally in terms of perhaps winners and losers?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's obviously something to ponder, not always to have a good grip on, because this is such a dynamic situation. But for me, I think I've been thinking of this in terms of two extreme narratives that play out globally and that have different implications in contexts like sub-Saharan Africa. So at their extreme, and they are sort of extreme narratives, I think you might think of one of these optimistic narratives that's around the sort of global New Deal, the Green New Deal revived, and that has, I think, the 1930s about it, right? It has this idea of a massive crisis that leads to a different kind of thinking about progressive social policy, economics, etc. We look at the global financial crisis, and we think, well, we didn't quite wake up from the neoliberal reverie that time, but maybe this might be different. And that would be about public goods being more invested in, safety nets, fairer distribution of risk in society, investment in accessible health, etc. And so I think the global implications of that might be things like substantial aid reform, investment in global public goods and the access to them, global disaster insurance, so the ability to access collective mechanisms for financing responses to global crises like this, which is still pretty much in its infancy. Even in its extreme, a sort of a decolonizing of global governance, a sense that actually everyone's in this together and the voices at the table need to be more equal and fair. I think, in contexts like Sub-Saharan Africa, that could result in, social reformers being more on the rise because they're part of the zeitgeist at the time. Innovations around, universal income, basic income, on access to a more support safety nets that don't really quite exist, and have an investment, importantly, in public infrastructure and services, which has been lacking for quite some time. So that's, I think, the version that is interesting to think, will that transpire? But there is another pessimistic version, a narrative that is also has its historical antecedent, and that's one in which there's a retreat and a response of sort of a more hard-nosed, self-interested response that occurs within the global north around this crisis and around the domestic crisis, and a retreat as a result of that. And I think that's where the global problems become Africa's problems in a sense. The kind of antecedent for that is the 1970s, I think, where you have a global economic crisis that has global causes and origins, affecting commodity prices, affecting terms of trade, leading to economic crisis and collapse of developmental trajectories in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But that then turns into domestic political crisis, a rise of more sort of strongly authoritarian governments who can't afford the sort of traditional models of politics as much because of the fiscal constraints they're under, and really big socioeconomic effects. And this was a lost decade, as it's well known, but it becomes problematized as a local problem of African governance. And there is that risk again here that we see something that starts very far away, that has implications, leads to the kind of economic and social problems and malaise that then creates political crisis. And I mean, these are obviously just speculative thoughts, but the question for me is, which of these antecedents seems to be more likely to play out a role? And it's very hard to tell at this point, but with sort of very significant implications. And as I said, I think the concern here is that this is going to play out on a much longer time frame because of the way in which many African societies and economies are price takers in the system, and a lot of the effects come from the global context rather than domestically. That will play out over some time.
Thank you. I have a question for Kamia, and then we'll hand over to go over to questions from the audience. Kamia, you mentioned in terms of the short-term impacts in your presentation, the immediate decline in economic activity associated with the lockdown, the decline particularly in services, and the disconnect between real economic activity and share prices. Could you maybe do a little bit of crystal ball gazing into possible medium-term economic consequences of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, we've done some very preliminary work with colleagues with colleagues, and we find that there's huge uncertainty about what will actually happen in the medium term. I think markets are betting on that. There's good news about the vaccine, as we've seen recently, that a vaccine will be developed very fast. It will be distributed in advanced economies and then slower down to emerging markets and developing countries. And I think it's a very dangerous assumption because it's not. I think even though we have these good news, I think that we will observe that people will not go into restaurants. They will not spend their money. Lots of livelihoods that have been protected, jobs that have been protected. There's very high likelihood that they will, these cannot be sustained in the medium term. And so I think I'm very pessimistic about the recovery. I think the recovery is not going to be this V-shaped fast recovery. And this really has implications for, inequality, as we talked about. This will have implications for, just the divergence before in the Great Recession. China was growing very fast. The developing and emerging markets were growing very fast, even though advanced economies were slowing down. So kind of the gap was narrowing. We're observing the gap will widen. I think it will have implications for climate change. We've been talking a lot until this health crisis, about climate change, Paris Agreement. We've been talking about net zero targets. Now policymakers, I think we have to be very careful because they might turn to thinking about jobs and not, jobs that come from green recovery. We have to have fast and quickly get people back into employment. So I'm very concerned. There are a number of things going on, and obviously, if the markets, if it turns out that the markets are wrong, then obviously we'll also have implications for household wealth and firms. So yeah, I think it's not crystal clear, but there's huge uncertainty, and I tend to be on the sort of lower bound of these estimates. And IMF, which I've showed you, they tend to be sort of in the middle, and the markets tends to be sort of very optimistic.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions from the audience, which is great. So I'm going to try and work through as many of these as I can. Ruhi, perhaps I can start with you. There's one from Richard Dickinson who asks about, you mentioned about ventilators being almost built from a dishwasher, but in terms of more cutting edge technology. Is there any role for 3D printing, either in your project or others that you know of, in the manufacture of ventilators? You might.
Sorry, I did it again. So the initial prototype actually was made entirely from 3D printed parts, and this has been an extremely useful tool for us when developing a design, because we can think of an idea, make the CAD drawing, and then get it printed and see whether it works functionally, and then if it does, make it out of materials which are more suited for this medical application. So it has been an extremely useful technique that we've used.
Thanks. Charlotte, I have a question from Gillian Stone, who asks, particularly given that the coronavirus can mutate, how can we stop more dangerous strains from spreading across the world in view of global travel and in the fact that early detection may be difficult because people can spread the disease asymptomatically?
There's two different parts to that question, really. One thing I will say is that SARS, the original SARS, sort of bigger, nastier cousin of the COVID-19 virus, you actually find that people who survived SARS, which caused much more severe disease and much higher mortality rate, though fortunately didn't spread as far, they have B cells, so antibody producing cells, and also T cells, which are viral killers, that will happily neutralize and stop in its tracks the current coronavirus. And so actually I think that COVID-19 could probably mutate quite far in some respects in its sequence before it escaped from the antibody responses that people are already producing. I do wonder if we have to move towards systems which are becoming popular in China and also Austria, with some incoming flights where people are just tested either at the airport or when they arrive, because that is, while we do get false negatives, people who are actually incubating the virus, but they don't have quite enough in their nose and throat to be detected by the standard swab system, it's much better than temperature screening, which just misses the vast majority of people who are incubating an infection. And the technology exists. It is certainly possible to design a test that could be administered on a strip of paper that you put in your mouth, or a swab that's tested in a sort of half-an-hour system that could be established in an airport, where we would simply test people either before they got on a flight or after they arrived, and either deny them boarding in the first place or quarantine them on arrival. We could do it, but we have to decide that we want to invest the time in the money and the equipment to make that possible. And it would not work very well, for example, with things like short haul flights and sort of pile them high, turn them around fast model that's relied on by people like EasyJet and Ryanair. And that feeds into this idea of, do we want a green recovery or not? Do we want to continue to dissuade people from taking short haul flights all over the world for very short trips? Because that would be one way to reduce a lot of inter-country transmission, would be if you could persuade people not to go on short haul breaks anymore.
I've got a question for Camilla here this is actually from Colin Barnes from the Centre for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governance. And he asks, to what extent has economic modelling taken into account the probability of coronavirus Mark II and the possible additionality of winter flu and other seasonal health issues?
Yeah, I mean, most of these forecasts that I showed you were essentially that we will come out of lockdown in a phase 2, that we slowly come out of lockdown. In advanced economies, and obviously in emerging and developing countries, some of them the action is happening now, so we're in phase 1. But yeah, I mean, if you think about another lockdown, whether they're local lockdown, national lockdowns, any other containment policies, that is very likely. I mean, they would basically even flatten these forecasts even further. So basically, and that's mainly what I believe in, is that it's very difficult with people traveling. We just heard people are traveling, and it's very likely in the absence of effective treatment vaccines that this will, there will be another outbreak, in which case we'll economic activity will be hit. And I think that will reduce confidence even further. So, and therefore will reduce projected growth in 2021. I don't think this is something will come out, and I think any forecast that we see now, end of 2021, we're not going to be back to where we were in 2019. This is, I mean, the economic loss that we are kind of observing at the moment is significantly larger than under the global financial crisis. So this is very big, and any hit to confidence, I think, will further reduce growth prospects.
Thank you. I have a question for Sharath from Tom Matthew, who asked, what can be done to make sure that developing countries have access to a vaccine? And are religious or cultural beliefs about vaccines or issues of trust likely to be a challenge to vaccinating on a wide scale in developing countries?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's been a lot of attention to the access to a vaccine, and that's happening on a global level. That's really positive to see the amount of very constructive thinking and policy action that's been going into that. I think the reality of that, of course, is that the very production processes involved and the time that will take to produce enough vaccine is going to stretch out over time, and that's going to mean there are those who have more access quicker and those who don't. And I think that how that plays out will invariably be at the expense of those who've put less money in and who have less power in the global stage. So that is, of course, a concern. I think the second point is perhaps even more of a concern, which is that all vaccine drives of whether it be polio, MMR, etc., they've faced various different challenges in different contexts that are very local, very specific, and in contexts like Somalia, polio vaccination been only very recently able to succeed to the point that it's considered to not be a risk in the country. That's only just a few years ago. And I think there is going to be a lot of time that it will take for the vaccine drives, especially in countries where populations are growing very rapidly and also quite often inaccessible, and counting and knowing exactly how much coverage there is something that is not an easy thing to do, that it will play out over a long period of time. But of course, the herd immunity point is probably most critical, which is, where are the highest risks, who is most at risk, and how do we reduce transmission by having sufficient levels of vaccination. But yeah, I think there's a lot of experience in communicating around vaccines effectively and a lot of learning around that, and it's not going to be particularly different to that, but all that experience shows that it's certainly not as easy as discovering the vaccine and turning it on.
Thanks. I would want to follow up with that with a question, and probably to Charlotte, that actually picks up on that last point about timing. And also, Charlotte, you mentioned the possibly foolhardy promise of vaccine by Christmas. The question from Francis Cutts is, assuming that one or more vaccines prove to be safe, how long will it realistically take to widely administer it and to develop a level of herd immunity in developed or developing countries to give people the confidence to come out and return to normal?
So I read a figure today that I think puts it in perspective from Peter Piot, who I think helped to sort of discover Ebola. He's done an awful lot of work at London School of Hygiene. He said that there are not enough glass vials in the world to contain enough vaccine for coronavirus, let alone enough vaccine. And which vaccine is successful will also have a massive effect on how quickly it can be rolled out. Some of the vaccines that are in development require completely new technology where we don't even have the factories to build them yet. So Bill Gates has been investing in getting these factories started, even if it turns out that that vaccine technique doesn't work and that factory is not needed. He thinks that the factories need to be built in case they do turn out to be successful. There's vaccine technologies that are being tested in China and the military at the moment that work on very old vaccine technology, which is simply to grow the virus up in vast quantities and then inactivate it with something like formaldehyde or formalin. But that we already have massive vaccine production facilities in place all over the world that could be switched to making a COVID vaccine. So that would often mean that they would have to stop making another kind of vaccine. So we might see a reduction in the global supply of something like the measles vaccine. So I think we might start to see the first doses. Let's say that one of the UK produced vaccines or the European produced vaccines is shown to work. We will see the first doses in the new year, if not before, but they're going to go to a very small proportion of people. And it's highly likely that the people they go to will be healthcare workers. Because firstly, we need our highly trained staff to be well enough to treat people if there is a second wave, but also, as we've seen in other parts of the world, I think in Pakistan, those staff are very, very scared that they are on the front line. They have incredibly high mortality. And one of the reasons to give them the vaccine first would be to give them the confidence to go into work, because nothing is going to cause a catastrophe that will really plow us into the ground like our medical staff being too scared to turn up for work. And I think it's incredible how brave healthcare staff all over the world have been with very severe restrictions on the PPE that's available to them. So I think even perhaps before the most vulnerable health-wise in society, for example, our very oldest people, I think it's likely that healthcare workers would get the first doses of the vaccine. But I mean, to produce a global vaccine supply, you need to be thinking on a 5 to 10 year timescale just with the manufacturing. And if it's one of the new sort of RNA-based vaccines, I mean, we could be looking at a longer timescale still, because we just don't have the manufacturing capability there to make these vaccines in high enough quantities.
Thank you. Perhaps a question for Camilla, an economics one. This is from Alonso de Garturi. How do you explain that emerging markets have suffered less in their economies vis-a-vis than developed economies?
So, I mean, I think one of the reasons, I mean, people look at these graphs and usually say, oh, China is going to still grow positively by 1%. That's really amazing. You have to remember that China has been growing at the 7 to 8% a year. So this is a huge drop in economic activity in China. It's a sizable drop in people's livelihood. So the fact that they're barely growing does not mean that they're doing better. It's very relative. But, you know, if you look at Latin America, for instance, that's not necessarily the case. If you look at projections in Latin America from, this is again baseline that, you know, there is no second outbreak, I think IMF was saying something like 9.4% drop in Latin America and the Caribbean. In advanced economies, the drop is going to be about 8%. So actually, it's much larger. The fact that emerging markets and developing economies seem to be growing more, you know, hit less than advanced economies is mainly China. So the estimates we have from the fund, for instance, says that advanced economies are dropping by 8%, emerging and developing economies by 3%. You strip China out of that, you suddenly notice that emerging and developing economies are going to do actually much worse than the advanced economies. So this is all driven by China, really.
Thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, we're almost out of time. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. This one perhaps to Shareth, and I have to say, Shareth, it's a pretty enormous one, so you might want to be selective in your consideration of it. This is from Tobias Mueller at Wolf Institute and Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge, who asked, to what extent do you think ideas of justice in terms of climate change, class and race will inform economic recovery programs in Europe and Africa, respectively? Again, you have probably a couple of minutes to answer this, so you may need to be selective.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a massive question. I think whether or not they inform economic recovery programs, it's hard to put a finger on. But I think what I would say is that there seems no better time for an agenda that is around progressive ideas and around integrative ideas on a global scale than now. I mean, you really are seeing the failure of populist kind of politics in terms of playing to the crowd as an effective means, so that, you know, if there's a time to rekindle and revive a trust in in expertise, in science, and time to rekindle and revive a belief that actually we do face global problems and we need to address them at a collective level. This should be that time, right? I mean, obviously the other response is retreat, and that will be there. There'll be a strong contingent pushing retreat. But this is the time, and there's a bunch of other things that are going on around this, around climate, around race, that means that there seems to be so much for grabs and at stake. And finding that voice and finding those possibilities to amplify those voices seems to be the critical challenge that we face right now. I think we sort of missed something when the global financial crisis hit in terms of a progressive agenda returning, and it needs to return now more than ever. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to find these ways to play a part in that.
Thanks very much. Apologies, I know we haven't got through all of the questions from the audience. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in this evening, to thank especially the panelists, each of our 4 panelists for speaking, and to thank King's College and the Centre for Geopolitics for also hosting the event. And just finally, a reminder once again, this session is recorded and will be available in a couple of days' time on the Centre for Geopolitics website. And with that, I just want to thank you and say good evening.